Hi, my name is Don Roscoe, and it's good to be back with you. In an earlier session, Dan Spader presented the last two disciple-making metrics for a healthy disciple-making church. Joel Zaborowski and myself are going to follow that up with a segment here dealing more with the implementation and the practical application of some of these principles into our life and into our church. As a pastor, I have placed a high priority in my own life on building relationships with people in the church and outside of the church, finding opportunities to share the gospel with them, challenging people to make a decision as they identify where they are and what their next step would be. And then ultimately, my goal is to mentor men and women towards a more mature faith. And I use the word mentoring rather than what's used in many churches, the idea of discipleship or discipling, because a mentor, by definition, is engaged in a much longer relational connection with a person. It's prolonged over a period of time. In many, many churches, the idea of discipling somebody is usually for a short period of time using a book or two. So we call it mentoring with the goal of, if you will, holistic development, that we're not just going to try to worry about the spiritual components of a person's life and what they believe and how they live, but more than that, the entirety of their life, how that affects their interpersonal relationships, how their health plays into that, their emotional well-being, etc. So I'm going to use the word mentoring from time to time, so just understand where we're coming from. Generally, discipleship in churches globally is seen as knowledge-based learning. That's the way it's generally viewed. If you say you're discipling somebody, it almost always means that you're communicating information to them, possibly filling out a book. And that may be important, but that seems to be the end-all in most churches, is how much does this person know? And to a lesser extent, normal church discipling, if you will, discipleship has a lot less life modeling involved. There's not as much experiential learning or skill development, and almost never is there any turnaround replication expected from the people that we meet with. It's almost like it's a sponge mentality. How much information can a person bring in? So that's why we use mentoring, because we want it to be holistic. We want it to be lifelong. We want it to have life modeling built into that. And the word mentoring is a concept that is known throughout the business world, the educational world, in what you and I might call the secular world around us. So when you bring a new person into the faith, if you say discipling or discipleship, that's a term they're unfamiliar with. If you talk about mentoring, they almost always connect with you. So I'm going to talk about mentoring. The disciple-making metric, or the mentoring metric in our church, as I would call it, is the idea of reproduction. Reproduction. I've been in our community, in our church here for a really long time, and over the past 40 years, I've coached a number of high school athletes in a variety of sports, 30 years of that as a American high school football coach. In fact, this slide that you should see up is a picture of the helmets that our team wears. We're called the Maple Valley Lions. There's no doubt about it that when you're a coach and you're helping athletes, there's some elements of equipment that a person needs. In track and cross country, they need certain shoes, maybe a pole vault. They have to understand what a hurdle is. In football, there's a helmet, shoulder pads, etc. Soccer, they have shoes, shin guards, all of that. But as a coach, I also have to help my student athletes understand certain knowledge. They have to develop certain skills, especially in the game of football. There's strategies that they have to understand, and everything revolves around those strategies. And the strategies change week in and week out based upon your opponent. There's certain performance behaviors that are expected of them. But my heart goal with student athletes has not just been to equip them with certain attributes that will help them to succeed on the field, but what I want my athletes, and when I've coached for many years, was to be able to turn around someday and to coach somebody else. whether those athletes, as young men, were coaching a junior team where maybe they're coaching children, grade school. Ultimately, my goal was always to help my athletes to be able to turn around, take what they've learned, and someday coach their own child or grandchild. And that's been one of my joys over 30 years involved in football, is watching many of the former team, the players that I coach, come back and serve as coaches in one component or another, one element or another of the coaching program here in our community. Because of this, my mindset, my language, behavior, expectations, and planning has to emphasize what I call not just personal development for this particular athlete, but what I call generational development, so that what I'm teaching them, they can turn around and teach somebody else, if need be, within the next hour. The same skill set, the same terminology could turn around. By doing that, they are passing on their faith, if you will, in their sport to another athlete. And then that athlete is trained to coach somebody else. That's generational development. It's very much what the Bible pictures for you and I as disciples who make disciples. I heard an interview with a well-known Jewish rabbi a few years back, and he was asked this question. The man asked him, he says, how do you know if another man is Jewish? And the old rabbi kind of looked at him, turned his head, kind of blinked his eyes a couple times, stroked his beard, and he was thinking. But then he replied this way. He scratched his head, mulled an answer, and replied, I know a man is Jewish if his children and his grandchildren are Jewish. And that really caught my attention, because it's generational development. It doesn't matter what faith we have ourselves, and our calling by God is to pass that on to someone else who can then turn around and pass that on to another person. And if you know 2 Timothy 2:2, that's exactly what Paul is saying to Timothy. We have to be able to train people to train people. In the American business world, Ray Kroc is a famous name associated with the McDonald's industry. And he was asked once in an interview, back in the early days of McDonald's, as the corporation was exploding, and they said, how are you able to build such a tremendous corporate model when the average age of employment is 16 and the average stay of employment is about 9 months? And he smiled, and Ray said, we train teenagers to train teenagers to make hamburgers. And that, folks, is mentoring. That is disciple making. So if you think about it, that rabbi and Ray Kroc, the founder, one of the key founders of McDonald's, were onto something. They were using what the Bible calls disciple making to raise up the next generation within a family, or the next generation of workers within their company. Now, my experience in ministry has shown me that many churches struggle in that area. Once they get a person to make a decision for Christ, they often just settle for the person to attend a church service or some other program. They may ask them to join, to give, or to serve, but rarely is there any well thought through plan on what we want to impart into that person, and in turn what we want that person to do with that information, to do with those skills and attitudes in terms of helping someone else become a maturing believer. My goal has always been exactly that, to mature believers who can reproduce their faith. In order to do that, we have to really think critically. What is the core DNA, if you will, of a mature disciple maker who can turn around and invest their life into somebody else and help them grow so that they in turn can do exactly that? As I've thought through things here at our church in my years as a youth pastor, I tend to use hand motions to help people follow along with me. So if you think of it this way, I point to their head and I say, what are the key beliefs? Not every belief in the Bible, but what are the core beliefs that a person should know? And how do I teach that to somebody so that they can teach it to somebody else? Most of the time we're thinking about the belief or the doctrine we want somebody to live by, but we're not thinking through how do I help them to grasp that truth, if it's an abstract truth, and then how do they turn around and impart that truth with simple words to a younger believer or a young family member. So I point to the head for beliefs. Then I point to their heart and I talk about attitudes. What are the key attitudes? The non-negotiable attitudes that we want believers to have. How do I impart those to somebody? And then how do I teach them to impart it to somebody else? We generally are just thinking about the attitude or the belief without giving some thought to how do I help them to grasp that, and at the same time turn around in somebody else's life and pass that on. So I go from their head to their heart to their hands ultimately, and these are the skills. What are the necessary skills that believers need to be a reproducing disciple maker? They don't have to know every skill that's in the Bible, but what are the core skills, the non-negotiables that you can then build on for the rest of their life? We go head to their heart, to their hands. Then I always point down at my heel, and I say, with your feet, you go from place to place and from person to person and group to group. It's your ongoing relationships. What are the key relationships that a person needs to have in their life so that they can reproduce faith? Well, we might think they need a mentor themselves, and they need to have access in the lives of other believers and into lost people. It's hard to make disciples if you don't have any existing and ongoing healthy relationships. So we go from head, that's your beliefs, to your heart, that's your attitudes, to your hands are your skills. You point to your heels, that's the ongoing relationships. And then I just, like this, as though I'm putting a big circle around me, and I say that is your habits, your lifestyle or behavior, the way that people see you and the way that they know you. What are the habits, the daily routines that every maturing disciple maker should have? And again, not just know them, but how do I impart those to somebody else? And how do I help them to impart that then into the next generation? Churches would do well to think in terms of a plan that can impart their DNA. Every church may have different DNA that they want to impart in a believer. And you may want to do it quickly. You may want to do it over a prolonged period of time. But again, I found that most churches have never given that much thought. The content, how you're going to teach it to somebody and measure it, and then also how this person will turn around and impart it to somebody else. One of the easiest ways you can do this is have your adults work with children or work with teens. Not just sit in a church situation and soak up information, but then turn around within the church, reproduce the material, perhaps in a home group, the content that I've just talked about. And then it's much easier to do it with a lost person because we've developed skills within the church. Our church has a 1-year mentoring program to cover the basic areas that I've just talked about. It is a goal for everybody who attends our church. Now, does everybody go through it? Of course not. But we do have something that if a person wants to grow in their faith and become a reproducing disciple maker, we have a 1-year program, if you will, life on life, whereby we can impart the DNA of our church into somebody else. And in the process of that, we're trying to help them to learn how to turn around and replicate that in somebody else. All of that sounds good, but if you can't measure it, it'll never happen. So we've created a guided self-assessment tool to help each person evaluate where they are with the basic skills and attitudes, head knowledge, etc., that we're trying to build into their life. Every Friday morning at 7 a.m., I meet with 4 guys in another town, and we just talk through this mentoring program. And currently, we are in the process of having those 4 guys evaluate their life in one of the areas. And by doing that, they can assess where they have come from, where they are, and what their next step will be. Those are just some thoughts on the idea of reproduction. helping somebody develop and gain the basic DNA of your church, the basic DNA of what it means to be a disciple who makes disciples. It has to be done intentionally. It cannot be done haphazardly or with wishful thinking. If you think of a card house, building a card house, I think many of us have done that, and how cautious you have to be with placing cards, because just a little shift of a table, a little gust of wind, or maybe a nervous twitch in your hand will make all those cards come crashing down. We have to have as much care as we would give to building a card house, we have to give to the making of our disciples. Otherwise, we just turn out another generation of religious people who know the terminology, who can go to a church, but they're not very good at reaching anyone else and helping them be a follower of Christ. Joel Zaborowski is going to talk about our fourth metric, and that is the metric of multiplication. Hey, it's been a pleasure being with you, and I hope that this was helpful and will stimulate your thinking as a leader and also as somebody who is involved in a church ministry. All right? God bless you.